reporting to you live today from a typical American neighborhood. Behind me are homes just like the ones that millions of families can no longer afford. So today, we are asking one question. How does government policy in the United States and the Netherlands affect housing for families? And today, I'll be joined by data analyst Abdul and housing specialist Ryan. And we've been digging into the data, and what we found is not pretty. The median home price in America is now above $400,000. Millions of families are priced out completely. And this is not just a supply problem, it's a policy problem. Let's get into it. Here in America, homes go to whoever can pay the most. Simple as that. And right now, working families are unable to compete with the richest buyers, corporations. Private investors using hedge funds and private equity firms own about 20% of all single family homes in the United States. That's 1 in every 5 homes. Not housing families, but instead being used as a means to generate profit.
This graph right here goes to show you just how investor activity exploded after 2010, right after the foreclosure crisis. Families lost their homes, corporations bought them. That is not a coincidence. That is a system doing exactly what it was built to do.
And the government is helping them do it. Through a tax rule called Section 1031, investors can sell a home and immediately buy another one without paying capital gains taxes. Forever. And families don't get that. Only corporations do. An obvious disparity. Now, some argue that restricting investors would crash the housing market. That is a real argument. We will come back to it when we show you what happens in the Netherlands when they actually tried it. But first, the part of the story that goes back 90 years. The American housing crisis is not colorblind, and it never has been. In the 1930s, the federal government created maps grading neighborhoods for bank lending. Green meant good, red meant hazardous. And those red zones were almost always Black and immigrant neighborhoods. Banks were told not to lend there. That is called redlining. And it was an official US government policy.
Researchers at the NCRC analyzed 30 years of mortgage data. What they found is that neighborhoods marked hazardous in the 1930s still have the lowest mortgage lending rates to Black and Hispanic borrowers today. 90 years later, the maps changed, but the gap did not.
That is not history. That is happening right now. So we have corporations buying up homes, a tax code rewarding them for it, and a racial lending gap that has lasted nearly a century. That is the American housing crisis. Now, let's go to Ryan on what is happening in the Netherlands.
Thanks, Emma. I'm Ryan, and I've been looking at the Netherlands. It is a small, densely packed country, and unlike America, the Dutch government has historically taken direct responsibility for housing its people. They have one of the largest social housing sectors in the world, housing associations managing affordable housing homes for millions of residents. But even with all of that, the Netherlands has its own crisis.
In cities like Amsterdam and Utrecht, the waitlist for social housing is over 7 years. 7 years. A family could apply for housing, have a child, and watch that child start school before they ever move in.
And here in America, only 1 in 4 eligible households get any housing assistance at all. The fact is that both countries have programs. Both programs are completely overwhelmed, but how they're trying to fix it is very different. In January 2026, President Trump signed an executive order to look into limiting how many homes institutional investors can buy. On paper, that sounds significant, right? But let's look at what it actually does.
The order splits responsibility across 7 federal agencies: Treasury, HUD, USDA, the VA, FHFA, GSA, and the Attorney General. It never defines what counts as an institutional investor. There is no enforcement mechanism. Legal experts say it is vulnerable to court challenges. It is a political statement, not a solution.
Now, compare that to what the Netherlands did in 2022. They passed the buy to let ban, a real law. It gave cities direct legal authority to stop investors from buying homes in specific neighborhoods. No gray area. Cities could act immediately on their own.
Rotterdam implemented the ban, and investor purchases dropped by 73%, and home prices did not crash. That is the argument people always make against restricting investors. Rotterdam proved it wrong.
Owner occupancy went up. Families were buying homes instead of corporations. That is a real measurable result. The US executive order, however, cannot produce that because it has no legal power to enforce anything. Now, before we hold up the Netherlands as a perfect model, we need to be honest. Both countries made the same mistake. In the US, government backed mortgage programs and the mortgage interest tax deduction increased the number of buyers without increasing the number of homes. More buyers chasing the same homes. Prices go up. The Netherlands did the exact same thing.
And we can see it right here. Both countries followed almost identical home price growth patterns through the 2000s and 2010s. Same policy mistake, same result.
And the Netherlands has its own identity based disparities too. Research shows migrants face documented discrimination when trying to access rental housing there and make up more than half of the registered homeless population. There's also 2005 Dutch law called the Rotterdam Wet that restricts lower income residents from moving into certain neighborhoods. Evaluations show it has not improved living conditions while hurting migrants and people on benefits. Both countries have structural inequality problems, just different versions of it.
So, who actually has the power to fix this? In both countries, the federal government sets the big rules. Local governments control zoning and permits, and private investors control what actually happens in the market. The key difference is this: in the Netherlands, cities can act on their own. Rotterdam did not wait for anyone's permission. In the United States, cities generally cannot restrict investor purchases without federal or state approval.
The Dutch ban had one clear path from law to action. The US executive order splits authority across seven agencies. That creates coordination problems, legal risk, and delay. When it is not clear who is in charge, nothing gets done.
And on the corporate side, hedge funds in the US operate largely outside SEC disclosure requirements. We often don't even know the full scale of what they are buying. In the Netherlands, investor activity is more directly regulated and visible. You cannot fix a problem you cannot see. First, we welcome Patrick Lassiter, a Carey Academy history teacher who is a new homeowner in the area. What personal experiences as a member of a new family new to the area have informed these notions about the housing market?
Well, as a person and a historian, I don't think the housing market's ever been really fair. Historically, there are people who've been left out, people who've been restricted. I'm sure you're pretty familiar about this point of like redlining and the historical impacts of that. So I don't think that it's ever been truly fair. For young families in general, I think there are bigger forces at work than just like maybe specific housing policies. We are dealing with a time where wages are not meeting rising costs, and housing costs are continuing to rise. In terms of the one policy, if I could pinpoint one, I would caution against like private equity being able to buy up homes. I think that is one of a thing that could be controlled. I'm not going to say like, all right, my boomer parents need to move out of their home and make way for the next generation of families. Certainly.
What are trends you have noticed since you moved into the area, and does it remind you of any historical parallels?
For our family, I continually think that we were very lucky in terms of our latest move. We needed to have more space. We could not get anybody who was willing to add on to our previous home because it was during the pandemic, and one company flat out said like, we only do work for people who are going to pay us more or do bigger renovations or add-ons. So we moved, but our timing was very fortunate. that we moved into the neighborhood before prices skyrocketed, and we had a good realtor who um, advised us on the bidding for the house, and then when the and then we sold after the market had kind of exploded. So we ended up very lucky, but we acknowledge that our family, at least on our salaries, would not have been able to live in this neighborhood to, I guess.
Now, we interview economics teacher RJ to gauge his thoughts on the housing crises, their causes, and their implications. How do supply constraints, such as zoning laws or construction costs, interact with demand in the housing market? And why do these forces often lead to rising prices that outpace wages for working families?
It's a big trend of what's called NIMBYism, not in my backyard. And that, some of that can be attributed to social factors. Some of that can be attributed to, people not wanting people of a lower socioeconomic status living in the same area because they believe that might reduce the quality of life in their community. Some of that may go back to, prejudices, whether those be racial, religious, et cetera. But, the inherent sort of economic incentives already like prime the pump for people to have those attitudes. And then when you add on top of that all of these other things, it does become much, much more difficult to get housing supply built, even sort of under ideal conditions, whether that be in a country like the United States or the Netherlands. So
How does treating homeownership like an asset for investors impact its role as a basic need, and what are the trade offs between encouraging investment and protecting less wealthy buyers?
it would be lovely to have private capital being invested in actually building new things, creating more supply, lowering prices for that reason. But what we have right now is private equity not actually like contributing to a broader base under which we can all prosper, but sort of extracting value out that already existed by taking ownership of things that will wind up being owned by someone one way or the other. And they are able to use their sort of, greater market leverage to take that value for themselves rather than have be more broadly spread to private individuals. So
Thank you, RJ. Now, Abdul and I will be presenting possible solutions to this crisis. So, what actually works? Based on the evidence, four things. First, restrict investor activity with specific enforceable laws, not vague executive orders. Rotterdam showed us that when the law is clear, the results are real.
73% drop in investor purchases. Prices stayed stable. Families got homes. The evidence is there. A win-win.
Second, reform the tax code. Limiting Section 1031 would remove the tax advantage that right now only exists for corporate buyers. Third, invest directly in building more homes. Both countries underfund affordable housing relative to need. Subsidizing more buyers without building more homes just drives prices up further. And fourth, enforce anti discrimination laws with real consequences. In the US, the Community Reinvestment Act gives communities a way to push banks into reinvesting in formerly redlined neighborhoods. That pressure needs to be consistent and backed up with real consequences. None of these solutions are perfect. Even the Dutch ban had trade offs. When investors left, the buyers who replaced them were more often Dutch born, which meant lower income renters sometimes lost housing options even as conditions improved for owners. Every policy has consequences. The goal is to make sure that people who have been losing for decades finally get a fair shot.
Let me put the numbers on the table. Institutional investors own 20% of U.S. single family homes. Only 1 in 4 eligible United States households gets housing assistance. Dutch social housing waitlists are over 7 years in major cities. Rotterdam saw a 73% drop in investor purchases after the ban. Prices stayed stable. The NCRC analyzed 30 years of mortgage data. Black and Hispanic borrowers in formerly redlined neighborhoods still receive far fewer mortgages today. Migrants make up more than half of registered homeless people in the Netherlands. The United States executive order splits responsibilities across 7 agencies with no enforcement included. These are not just statistics, these are not just facts. Every number is a family that could not get a mortgage, a child on a 7 year wait list, a community written off by its own government.
Both countries built systems that were supposed to help families. Both systems ended up helping investors more instead.
The Netherlands showed us something very important. Restricting investor activity can work without destroying the market. Rotterdam is proof. The US knows what the problem is. The executive order says so. What it is missing is the legal power to actually change anything.
Families on both sides of the Atlantic are still waiting for that to change. For the Housing Report, I'm Emma.
And I'm Abdul.
I'm Ryan, and thank you for watching today's Housing